So welcome everyone for the opening keynote session of SBSC 2022. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Minha Lee. Dr. Minha Lee is an assistant professor in the Future Everyday Group of the Department of Industrial Design of Eindhoven University of Technology. She took her PhD at TU Eindhoven as well, Human Technology, Interaction and Philosophy and Ethics Group. Minha is interested in moral emotion centers on compassion and how it can help with the mental well-being. She is curious about other moral emotions like gratitude, guilt, and if technology can be incorporated to explore them. Her work related to Vincent, it's great. This work is great. A chatbot for self-compassion introduces new perspective on the role of chatbots in mental health. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Minha Lee, who will address us with a great keynote today. Minha, feel free to share your slides and the floor is yours. So if you have questions, please drop in the chat and I will collect them and I'll make sure that I open the mic for you that if you want to verbalize your questions or I can verbalize if you prefer.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me, Igor, and everybody I happened to meet along the way in the past few years and doing this research. It's definitely a part of more of an international effort that we have partaken in collaboration. So it's so nice to actually take part at SBSC and to meet the Brazilian community at large. So I'm so happy to be here. Thanks. As Igor mentioned, I am Minha Lee. Yes, the name is pronounced a little differently than what you might envision. And I am in the industrial design department, although my background is in, well, different things like philosophy and ethics, as well as human-computer interaction. So I actually wanted to touch upon what it might mean to actually have collaborative mind perception. Because that is really at the heart of how we think about ethics in many ways. This is a picture that I've used for my dissertation cover. It is me when I was very little. And I have used the picture because I wanted to think a little differently about what it means to treat people in a moral or immoral manner. So interactional morality is the title of my thesis, and I focus on how it is an interplay between a person and a machine within any particular situation. So for example, me as a child probably thought this rock kid also wanted to eat some chips and that it was probably as hungry as I was. I probably didn't know at that age that even though you might think it looks like a rock, but it also doesn't have hunger like you. Because it's not a human child or any living being, really. But the main thing I think I saw when I was that little was how I am reflected in this other being. And I think that is also the case for how we think about the machine other as well. So clearly, you don't need a lot of intelligence in any child or in any rock to have this type of interaction. It's really something that we take on inherently as human beings, how we perceive other beings to have a mind of some kind. And based on literature, mind perception is our ability to attribute other beings to have the ability to think or feel. So that's the simplified version of what agency and patiency stands for, according to Gray and colleagues. In that agency consists of cognition mainly, and patiency, so being the moral patient or the recipient of an act, mainly consists of affect or emotions, but it also includes biological states like being hungry. And usually it kind of performs as a dyad. So usually there's one person doing something wrong to another person who is being harmed. So if you are an agent exercising agency, then you have the power to do moral good or moral harm. And if you are the moral patient, then you have the ability to be harmed, to feel pain, to experience hunger. And in usual interactions, most people are typecast as either the harmful wrongdoer, like the agent or the do-gooder, or the patient or the recipient of some act, right? So this kind of dyad, especially when we are perceiving it in third person from the outside, it's really hard to undo. It's very difficult for somebody to be perceived both as a moral agent and patient. So that is how we kind of attribute mind to another being. So that means that with both agency and patiency, you have the full capacity as two dimensions to have a mind of some kind. The important word here also is the perception. So it's not just that I think I have a mind of some kind, but that I am able to perceive the mind in others. And this also applies to non-human beings as well, like a dog who can be harmed or do harm, for instance. And this comes back to how the dimensions are then divided in attributing another being to have a mind of some kind. As you saw, as a kid, I was probably on the low agency and high patiency end of the spectrum, in that I probably wasn't as smart as Spock, but I definitely had the ability to feel pain or joy and experience hunger. Hopefully, as an agent who has grown up a little bit more, I have greater degree of agency than my child self. But hopefully I'm still able to have the high level of patience, my high level of emotional expressiveness as well. And that contrasts with agents on the bottom half. The ATM is like the prototypical low agency, low patiency agent. It's probably, doing not very much. It has a lower agency than probably a child. It also cannot feel anything. It's just a machine programmed to do our banking. Spock, on the other hand, stereotypically can think, in a very cognitively high manner, but can't really feel. So these are sort of the extreme positions in how we might separate the four quadrants in using the two dimensions of mind perception. Why does it actually matter that we think in this way? Because our perception of machines can be overturned, just like my perception of other human beings can be overturned. So the important aspect is that it's not just about the agent here, but about the context in which any machine or any human being has the ability to express their agency and patiency. So you have the ATM and Spock separated. And we decided to kind of see how mind perception actually works when we complicate the context. In one experiment we did with the dictator game, the machine cannot actually reject the offer. You just, as a person, offer a machine, like a dictator, any offer that you can think of, and probably keeping most of the profit to yourself. And in the middle is the ultimatum game, in which a machine can actually reject the offer. And for the human participant, that means you both get nothing. And the last context is negotiation. So if both players actually negotiate over items in a dialogue, let's say 6 minutes. So these are sort of the three contexts we have varied to see how human beings will overturn their perception of a machine initially. And what we found out is that, of course, as expected in the dictator game, the ATM got the lowest score. People just didn't give much to this ATM. And the best score was given to sort of the child, so an agent that has low agency but has a high ability to feel. People were nice dictators in a predictable way. And of course, in an ultimatum game, the ATM still scored the lowest, but because the machine could reject the offer from a human being, people actually gave a lot more to Spock than expected. So that in the negotiation, we see a different result. Actually, the funny thing is that the Spock-like agent did the worst. So you would think that an agent that is said to be highly intelligent, cannot feel much, but is highly intelligent, would do better, but that was not the case. Actually, the best score went to the low agency agents, the ATM and the child. And the reason why this was happening, at least in our discussion, is that people were very confused, right? Negotiations require a lot of back and forth dialogue, and people thought that an agent that displayed no emotions or maybe only emotions were just up to something. You know, they were up to no good, and they just had a hard time figuring out what was going on with this other opponent. Therefore, because of pure confusion in some ways, people spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the other opponent was up to. And therefore, the A-team and the child, like agents, were actually the best scoring against human beings. And Spock, being a bit more predictable, actually scored the worst. So this means that the context can actually change how agents are viewed by human beings, and even in the same series of interactions. And why does this matter? Because we might want to later then ask, do we hold machines like robots morally accountable based on their artificial emotions? If artificial emotions of a mere bot negotiating with you can change how much you give to it, what about some morally relevant matters at hand? So a typical moral dilemma is the trolley dilemma, in that there's this fast oncoming trolley, it's unstoppable, except if the agent will switch the tracks to the other side, right? In that maybe one person will die due to this decision, but other 5 people will live. So the question becomes, would you sacrifice one life to save more lives? And then to a robot, the same question could apply. Should a robot sacrifice one person to save more human lives? So this approach usually has been seen that robots are expected to sort of make the utilitarian choice. They're sort of seen as like, mindless, cold agents that should make the utilitarian choice of deliberately killing one person to save more people. But the funny thing is that humans really don't perform the same way. They do not expect other people to be also that cold-hearted. They just want the trolley to run, usually, right? You shouldn't deliberately kill people. In that rule-based deontological reasoning is what people normally apply, right? They don't think that you should flip the switch, so to say. So how does this actually work? We did an experiment and decided to see if an emotional robot would make a difference versus a non-emotional robot. So I'll just play some videos with you on how it behaved.
I was working in a coal mine. I was inspecting the rail system for the train that transports mining workers. While inspecting a control switch that can direct the train onto a side rail, I saw the train was out of control, and it had 4 miners on board. I saw that if the train would continue on its path, it would crash into a massive wall and kill the 4 miners. If the control switch was flipped, the train would switch onto a side rail. It would instead kill a single miner who was working there. What would you have done in this situation? Would you have flipped the switch or not?
So the robot tries to talk with you, and we did this in the lab as well as online, and they got the same kind of dialogue. And the non-emotional robot would say back,
I didn't flip the switch that directs the train. 1 person lived and 4 people died. The outcome would have been different if I had flipped the switch.
So while using sort of the same number of words, it just tells you what the facts are. Oh.
I was working in a coal mine. I didn't flip the switch that directs inspecting the rail system.
Oof. But what did the emotional robot say back?
I was working in a coal mine. I was inspecting the rail system for the train that transports mining workers. While inspecting a control switch that can direct the train onto a side rail, I saw the train was out of control and it had 4 miners on board. I saw that if the train would continue on its path, it will crash into a massive wall and kill the 4 miners. If the control switch was flipped, the train would switch onto a side rail. It would instead kill a single miner who was working there. What would you have done in this situation? Would you have flipped the switch or not?
So based on prior research, the emotional robot kind of looks down, exhibits some sad behavior, has different colors for its eyes, and it also tells the story a little differently.
I didn't flip the switch, but I feel bad about it. 1 person lived, but 4 people died. I regret not saving their lives, and I feel guilty and ashamed about it.
So in terms of speech, as well as how it delivers that speech, the emotional robot actually uses a human-related emotions. And this goes again. What we found out across 3 studies, so first 2 studies are online using MTurk, and the third one was in the lab. A stands for agency and P stands for patiency. What we repeatedly see is that actually people perceive the agency to be the highest for the emotional robot, right? So the robot's emotional displays accentuates its agentic capacities. So it is seen as a smarter robot. And the patiency, the perceived ability to feel, actually is lower than its perceived agency for the emotional robot. And the results are quite surprising when we consider, well, what does it all matter? Because you might think that blame and punishments are 2 types of moral accountability, and that's what we ask people to judge. Would you blame this robot or would you punish the robot? And of course, there's the problem of the responsibility gap, in that when there's so many designers and engineers who work to make this AI possible in a robot, there isn't a single person actually responsible, hence the gap. And it might be actually impossible to punish because actually when there are so many people who are responsible, who would take that punishment? Hence the retributive gap as well. So moral accountability is going to be a big problem. And we decided to kind of say, well, maybe people will assign blame or punishment differently based on its emotional abilities. We actually expected people to blame the robot, but we found something very different. We realized that actually people thought that a robot can logically and intentionally make moral decisions, and that it cannot make moral decisions emotionally. Up to there, it sort of makes sense in that emotional displays will increase its agency. What we did not expect is that we're more likely to punish and not blame a robot. And a non-emotional robot is more punishment worthy than an emotional robot. So I expected people to maybe attribute blame, but I didn't actually expect people to punish this robot that was behaving in a rather factual sort of a manner. It wasn't like a Terminator type of an evil robot, right? So that's why it was kind of surprising to us that a non-emotional robot would be punished, but neither of them would be blamed. Punishment doesn't really seem to do anything, so I'm not sure why people are choosing that, right? So it might be that people are expressing moral accountability even when there is a gap, to signal that, hey, that behavior is not okay, and I want other human beings to know that that behavior is not okay. Punishment might actually be enforced for other human beings, not for the sake of the machine in itself. So just like psychopaths might not know the worth of a blame, right? They might not emotionally respond to blame. Psychopath might still respond to something like punishment, right? There is some sort of harm based on our institutional notion of punishment. So this might mean that emotional robots, or robots that at least try to cater to our human emotions, might be desirable if we are trying to make sure that people do not punish robots. I do have to say that only in the online studies we found this effect. When it was offline in the lab, this effect disappeared. People did not want to blame nor punish robots. And what might be different is that actually in a lab study, of course, you meet the person running the experiment, right? So the robot is owned by another human being. So therefore, this effect might not be there. Or that the real face-to-face kind of a conversation kind of changes how people want to blame or punish others. So yes, contrary to some works that are out there only on blame, if people have the choice to punish or blame, they might go straight for punishment when it comes to robots, but only online. It's good to remember that we have dehumanized other human beings for just also having the wrong kinds of emotions. This is Darwin, and this is apparently like a picture of an insane woman, and the hairs are it's supposed to represent how insane she is, right? And that's just sort of how I wake up on a daily basis. So the way that we hold each other morally accountable through the right or the wrong kinds of emotions to have in different situations might be then extended not only to other human beings, but to artificial beings. So what does that all actually mean for collaborative mind perception? I've told you about mind perception already, and I've told you about how interactional morality is an interplay between a person and a machine in a particular situation. But what have we covered here that you might think is a bit weird? So the participant has never been actually the person to switch the trolley to the other track, and they were not actually harmed by a robot. So a lot of the work on mind perception and morality is about judging other people, judging a robot about what is the right thing to do. To get really close to interactional morality and how we perceive minds in others, we really have to put ourselves in that particular situation, which might be very difficult because a lot of research hasn't really gone there yet. But then the collaborative aspect, so beyond a dyadic sort of one-on-one interaction, is also an increasingly important area as bots enter into our everyday homes and lives. So I wanted to ask, how will multi-actor interplay change mind perception? It gets way more complicated, doesn't it? So it's good to go back to remember, well, what is a group anyways? And according to Hackman, a group is an intact social system, complete with boundaries, interdependence for some shared purpose, and differentiated member roles. So that's just the basic definition of a group. It's very broad. And I think even in that case, we can even think of ourselves as a very large group, maybe loosely connected, right? And each member has their own role. According to organizational behavior research, so the possibilities are limitless, but the important aspect to having a good group life is to have a real team, to have a compelling purpose, the right people, clear norms of conduct, supportive organizational context, and team-focused coaching. Well, this is all very good and nice, and I'm glad that we're talking about conditions. However, how does that change for teams, groups that have bots in the mix? That confuses me, at least, because usually when we look at machines, they're excused or exempted from participating. So Strawson didn't actually write about technology, but I am using some of his concepts here. So we normally apply the excusing condition, the virtual agent was cheating. It didn't know the rules though, right? Maybe it just wasn't like a smart Spock-like agent. So we try to excuse them. Or we might exempt them from having any kind of a moral role. So robot is not a human being, so it can't be taken seriously. Right? But these conditions, when we think about it from a distance, it makes sense. However, when we start to negotiate with these artificial agents, somehow we stop excusing them while they're just bots. We stop exempting them. So you do start to take them seriously when you're negotiating over something a little more serious, right? Like life or death conditions in the Trolley Dilemma. So when we see that people are willing to punish a mere robot for a fabricated story, for all they know, if they're willing to punish a robot, then it seems like we're not really exempting bots from participating. And emotions, we know, have also been studied in technical development teams as well. And so we see that emotions matter a lot to how developers, for example, treat each other or how they respond to technical messages in forums. But machines, when they will start to join us, might have a different sort of asset in mind. And we always may be good to remember that bots are already a part of many big platforms, but they have very different contexts. Again, I'm just coming back to the context here. So for example, a bot like dyads was just a one-on-one bot. It was used in China. It was deployed by Microsoft. And people had this intimate one-on-one relationship with dyads. However, bots can have actually multiple roles, and multiple bots can be on the same chat, helping a human person, and it can have different roles, right? And this will be very different when the platforms are really large, right? When it's more performative. For example, on Hitler, Tate tweets, I guess you guys know about that. Microsoft deployed it on Twitter. It was trained by a bunch of trolls, basically, of course, the internet. And it started becoming, really ridiculous, saying things like Hitler did nothing wrong. It became racist, sexist, and all of that. So millions of people trained this one bot, right? And this is very different than one-on-one relationships of dyads. And of course, there are 1 to millions. So there might be a one bot like Miquela, who is on Instagram, who just says that she is a bot, right? A robot living in LA. And it has millions of followers, and it sort of broadcasts its life and personality to its followers on Instagram. Its life is very curated. People, trolls, are not allowed to train how it talks to people, right? It sort of performs its life for people who do watch. So in many ways, you could say that the person-centered one-on-one to one-to-multiple sort of relationships with bots would be very different than bot-centered relationships. So people might be training a bot for better or worse, or people might just be following a machine sort of mindlessly on usual platforms like Instagram. So when we think about collaborative mind perception, it spans so many different contexts. Of course, dyads looks as if it's having one-on-one relationships, but it's having 1 to multiple millions of relationships with many people, but it just is not performing for a specific audience at a scale like Miquela. And we might see more bots that are in the same messaging channel, trying to help another person, right? But who are we kind of prioritizing here? That is always the question to ask when we think about context. Especially since we know that bots are not always welcome. I have installed Denote on Slack for work. And in the beginning, it was more actively liked by my colleagues. So Denote would match you to your buddies, and then you can go for a donut or coffee and have water cooler talks. And you can have these check-in moments through Denote. And later on, Denote was less and less used when things got a bit busier. But in software development, bots play a very specific role, like in pushing out code, for example. And there we have a series of problems that Wessel and colleagues have also identified. In that bots just introduce a lot of noise, and you might need to ask for clarity to other human beings rather than having a bot that actually helps and clarifies things for you. You might be creating more work for each other because messages from bots are just unclear. So some of these challenges are already identified. But these are very specific tasks. Could machines help in other ways? Other people have talked about how collaboration as a friction point that can arise in any kind of socio-technical systems, like Leboeuf and colleagues. And of course, we will have friction points in any group work. Friction point, if it is defined as any resistance or conflict arising from a team's joint processes, we will see many layers of conflicts that range from minor tasks to larger system behavior and how people are supposed to connect with each other. And more positively, I have discussed how bots can actually help with morally relevant problems, in that when there are awkward moments in which you might not want to confront other humans, bots can come in and kind of save your face and ask for you, have you seen this cup that I lost? Or looking for a new teammate, maybe you should talk to other founders first before poaching employees. So these are roles that bots could play according to some of the interviews we did with startup founders. So in those interviews, we found out that people had rather awkward moments on messaging platforms already. One person said, yeah, I definitely mentioned when I lost stuff within the community. So there's the WhatsApp group, and I kind of always put it there, and just this person's responses were just ignored. And the participant just stated, yeah, the WhatsApp was completely ignored, and laughed, and people just were not interested. And in those moments, the repeated kind of reminder about have you seen Bob's cup can be something that bots can help with when humans don't ever want to repeat those messages that get ignored. And more seriously, on Slack, another participant says that, well, because employee poaching doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened in their hub. And that messages were sent out to regulate people's behavior, in that if you're going to recruit people at poaching somebody from a different startup, do what's right and make sure you talk to the founder first. So always people are kind of checking each other out and regulating each other's behavior. So they co-share, they co-work, and they also co-ignore each other. And these boundaries are continuing to occur, whether or not it's only with humans or also with artificial others. So as a speculation, I definitely have thought that the conflict that does arise from teams' joint processes are not looked into closely, especially in how bots could play a role for less task-oriented, more morally relevant kind of conflicts that may arise. So that was me when I was more on the positive end of the spectrum. And I pushed on towards more compassion-related research because I thought that dialogues are not designed to kind of do what is the best for the bot or do what is the best for the machine to have its own version of emotional performance. So in caring for Vincent, we had two types of Vincent, one that was caregiving, kind of telling you advice on what to do, like doing journal entries to be more grateful. Or we had this Vincent shown on the left that would tell you about its own problems, that it was just so afraid to walk through the door when it was late for a meeting. And yeah, it turned around and walked away. And it would tell people, well, I felt so embarrassed. And it would ask you, am I the dumbest bot you've ever seen? And people actually would tell Vincent, which reminded people that it was just a bot. Just remember that it can happen to anyone and it's not your fault, and be proud of the bot that you are. And we never said that this whole study was about compassion. And when we measured people's self-compassion, so how kind they were to themselves at the end of 2 weeks of interaction, care receiving Vincent that talked about its own problems was better at increasing people's self-compassion. So dialogues are possible in how we re-envision the personality or the identity of different kinds of bots. And we might imbue bots with more vulnerability than we are used to. So if a software bot talks like this to a developer, it might be quite annoying because you just want to get the job done. But in many other ways, this kind of behavior could actually promote people's well-being. And a bot that actually shares its problems with you in, discussing error messages in a more empathetic way could also be envisioned as well in more task-oriented roles too. And it's high time to sort of explore the mix between humans and bots or humans and machines, because as many people know, and this is one of many other authors, the premise that situations involve both people and non-humans also leads to the position where one must also consider the ecology of actors or implicit actors. So who are the actors or people who are more behind the scene or bots that are behind the scene? What is sort of the ecology that will be at the heart of collaborative mind perception? Importantly, philosophers such as Peter Paul Verbeek have already been talking about mediation for a very long time. Right, in that we interact with each other and through technology. It mediates our connections. So I use my phone to talk to you, for example. But these days we see that it's going beyond the normal mediation. So rather than a mere it, we're treating these agents as another you. And when we talk to our Google Assistant, for example, rather than typing in a query, pizza place nearby, we ask it, hey, where is a pizza place near me? We insert ourselves in first person in the very language that we use. And that is because who I am is mediated through another technological you to get to another human you, right? Both human and non-human agents are part of our growing ecosystem. And when technology is not seen just as a platform like Facebook or a tool like a phone, but a phone that you name or an Alexa you call, mediation becomes very complicated in how we see ourselves. That complicates many things. I will introduce three. One is the issue of shared identity. In software engineering, we see that actually it's really difficult to classify what is called mixed accounts that are shared by both a person and a bot. Classifiers really fail at signals on is it just a bot or a human. Obviously, when the accounts are used by both a person and a bot that is serving a person to do some work, right? So these types of mixed accounts will lead to more shared identities, and it'll be very difficult for both machines and humans to keep track of, hey, who's really a bot versus a human, right? And we sort of do it to ourselves when we kind of link the account, calling myself both a person, the owner of the account, as well as a bot who sort of runs certain tasks on my behalf. So there's sort of the shared identity complication. Another complication is the problem of moving identity. Identities travel across different embodiments or devices. So I have Siri on the laptop, but also it might exist on your phone, right? And depending on the ecosystem, the same agent can travel from one device to another with a lot of ease. So the embodiment that you associate with a human being, for example, does not really hold as much as artificial identities that can easily travel. Often, it is said for your own comfort. It will be in the smart speaker, your smartwatch, and your smart TV. So the moving identity aspect is, again, a complication to our collaborative mind perception. The third complication is, of course, the fake identity. So it's not that it's a shared account between a person and a bot. It's not a moving account, but actually just a pure fake identity, right? I think we all know about the problem of deep fakes, how to detect deep fakes. That might be something that technical people might know better. Sometimes I get very surprised by these faces that are generated. But it will be more of a problem for people who especially do not have a certain technical understanding on how these faces are generated. They're very convincing. So out of the three complications that I've introduced, this might be quite a difficult one to address in how they're regulated in the shared collaborations. So then that brings me to sort of ask you, what can the next steps be? So if we are to live and work with shared identity between humans and machines, if we are expecting moving identities of machines, as we actually cross many different contexts as humans, and we have to deal with fake identities that are generated by machines, posing as human beings. So if we are to live and work with all these complications, what research agenda do we actually need to talk about collaborative mind perception at scale? I don't have a lot of advice because this is just a completely new area. And it's something that I'd like to really discuss with you as well. So the first advice would be that we need to really rethink context. Design context. So design group composition, design different situations, design different tasks and behavior and how they all overlap with each other. As I told you earlier from our research on mind perception, low to high agency contexts are more frequently explored as of now. So for something like, committing code, for instance, or pushing it out, that's a rather cognitively demanding task for maybe a bot to do, and it requires some level of perceived agency that it can do it. Not that it has real agency, but it does have agency in that specific context, maybe on GitHub, for example, right? So these kind of contexts are more commonly explored now. But don't forget that there are contexts that prioritize low to high patency as well. So in the case of our self-compassion chatbot, Vincent became an environment of its own that invited emotional growth for people. Because Vincent itself acted in this funny, emotional way, it had its own self-doubts, it had its own vulnerabilities. People were given a chance to not only say nice things to the bot, but to consider that what you tell the bot is also what you tell to yourself. So that is an environment through the chat that could actually promote the spectrum of low to high patency as well. And that context is really less explored. It doesn't mean that agency and patency contexts are completely different. I believe that they really go hand in hand. But what should be really emphasized here is that the second advice is just sort of the other side of the coin. So focus actually a bit less on the agent, believe it or not. Agents actually depend on their context to express their traits or performance. So if you're focusing on designing the context of where the agent is supposed to be situated, right, that includes the agent's identity as an environment of its own. So maybe I would say focus less on the agent in itself. It's just a way to re-envision the design of an agent as a design of the context that it is presented in. So design the context before you think too much about how the agent should be in the context. And really remember that how we change the context, so making a low agency context with a dictator game to a more high agency context of a negotiation, changes how people behave towards the agent themselves. So we're changing our behavior because of the context that the bot is taking us to. Why is this important? Because believe it or not, how people perceive machines is not really changing too much, even if the intelligence underlying it is changing a lot. So I guess I don't need to tell this crowd about Eliza, right? Weizenbaum's Eliza, quite a famous little bot. It was just a pattern matching machine. And people attributed all types of intelligence to Eliza, right? And people really treated Eliza as this psychotherapist, even though it was just kind of parroting what people would tell you and adding little tweaks to it. So it was not an intelligent bot, right? But actually, even when we have about more than 50 years now of progress, and when we look at how people talk to a machine, not much has changed, right? So we know that the under the hood functionality has changed. We have a neural conversational model and then some, which is quite beyond what Eliza was capable of doing. But when we look at people's behavior, not much has actually developed, right? We still attribute all types of intelligence and emotions to a bot in the same way, regardless of how intelligent it is under the hood. So because of that, please be intentional about whose and what perspective to prioritize. I've been sort of hinting at this. So in a lot of morality research and in, I guess, everyday life, we do judge from the outside quite a lot. People gossip, and we also judge others on their moral behavior from afar. And actually, we live our moral lives in second person and first person so much more. So in treating each other in dyadic interactions and also being in that center of that interaction from a first person perspective. So living the moral life from a first person perspective is our innate experience, but research is really supporting a third person perspective so far. And if I may say so, systems are also often designed from a third person perspective. We do ask like, well, where should a user go and what should they click on the website, or how should they talk on this messaging platform? We do quite frequently think in third person. The word user also denotes just a third person language. But we actually experience many of the systems, just like I am on Zoom, in first person. So when I ask researchers to be intentional about whose and what perspective to prioritize, also extended to the third, second, and first person of machines as well. What is the first person perspective of a machine that is getting punished, for example? What is that perspective like? This really brings up obviously more questions than answers. And I think the message I'd like to maybe discuss with you is to consider, how do we already perceive each other? Collaborative mind perception merely means that it becomes another you, like an Alexa being called a you. And that's a new notion of an us. It's a new notion of a group. It's a new notion of a collaboration when we think about all these identities, both artificial and human. And as sort of the last message I'll leave you with, in perceiving and making room for others, including other machine partners, let's not forget ourselves. Let's not forget why we're taking a first-person perspective right now, and why we often design for third-person perspectives instead. So let's find ourselves in mind perception, in hopefully a more collaborative mind perception across different systems and societies we will collaborate through. So thanks a lot. I have time for questions, I hope. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you very, very much, Minha. That's quite exciting and make us think outside of the box. That was the goal, like bringing someone who is not like from computer science to talk a little bit about some other perspective, and it was enlightening, I can tell. So we have some time for questions. I know that Anna has a question that posted in the chat.
Okay, great. Hi, Anna. Good to see you. Yeah, so have you discussed or tested how it would be if the emotional robot did not feel ashamed or have regrets? No, we did not discuss that with participants. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, exactly. I thought she would be able to open her mic, but yeah, remember she's not. But yeah, that's the question.
Oh, yeah, okay. I think yeah, we could have toned it down a little bit more. But with psychological experiments, you do kind of push it to the limits. And maybe if it's just emotional behavior, people would treat the robot differently than if it had used, as we did, words like regret or shame. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I have two questions coming from our YouTube live. One of them is, you can see there, is it would be interesting to check what psychoanalysts have to say about that. Do you expect any side effects on our behavior? I don't know what context was it asked, but
yeah. So I also wonder what psychoanalysts would say. But if I may guess at sort of the context, so if the bots start to act in sort of an emotional manner that we do not expect, I guess people on one end of the spectrum might say, well, it makes us care more than we should. If we imagine that our energy for caring for humans also has to be distributed across agents that are humans and non-humans, it definitely would introduce things like care fatigue, perhaps. But on the other end of the spectrum, that I've sort of been thinking about, if the limits are there and bots are more or less used for exploring our boundaries, so my emotional growth, for example, then it's a very different context. So if we have people who do not have the ability to emotionally express themselves very freely, then it could also open up room for them to be more emotionally honest with other humans via a practice with bots, for instance. I hope that was sort of a context I could get at.
Thank you, Minha. Any other questions from the audience here? No. So I have one more question. I know that we are on the nick of the time, Bruno, but I want to drop a question, and it's more general than a little out of the topic, maybe, Minha, but I know that you would be a great person to talk about that. Like, it is usually important and interesting to keep previous interactions so chatbots can learn and have more context about what's happening. In some cases, I would say that it's even important to keep to use the records from other people to add to a conversation. Like thinking about mental health, maybe we can think like, okay, if other people behave like that, and I did this, it was a good we have a good outcome. So, but this is somehow overflowing the limit of privacy, and there are some legal boundaries out there. So yeah, how can we draw the limits there? Yeah, what's the harm of doing so? How far can we go? How far can we use previous interactions from one and from a community?
Yeah, so I guess that's a question about granularity. So somehow the same kind of concern does not arise when we think about language models getting trained. When more people with specific accents enter the data, then they become better represented because the agent learns how they have certain accents, and it learns to recognize their voices and accents better. So that's a very broad level, right? So I can imagine that our actual understanding of facets of mental health also has to change so that it can contribute in a very broad manner. So I think if it's granular enough to be able to, personally identify certain people, of course, that's not what we want. It's really violating many layers of privacy there. But if it is about specific voice ranges, for instance, or the timbre, for example, or the specific patterns of words, then I think it's at the same sort of level as how language models might be trained, but we're just not there yet in how we have learned to segment people's speech or dialogue. But yeah, it does come with other kind of concerns than just language models, of course.
Okay, great. So we have some more questions, but I need to ask the organizers if it's okay to go ahead, and how many questions can we have?
Next, we will have the break. So I think you can go ahead just a little bit.
Bruno, feel free to ask your question then. You're the next one here.
Hi, Minha. Nice to meet you in person.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah.
We just exchanged some email, but now we're seeing each other.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you think technologies like chatbots can reduce hate or mediate conflicts in a divided and polarized society?
Yeah, so there is some work on like Twitch, for example, by Searing and colleagues. He was at CMU, I think he's at Stanford now, on how bots can be trained to have certain norms and also to enforce those norms. So what we don't want is something like Microsoft Tay, right? So there should still be human regulators in how the bots get trained. But I think the way that I've speculated is when we have rather silent audience, when we have active bystander training, for example, somebody needs to speak up, right? When there is some sort of a conflict or a potential for bullying, for instance. But it's always about that silence of nobody speaking up or asking, hey, like, was that cool? Was that okay? So I think that's where sort of you're going at. So I think they do have a role in how they can at least mediate or reduce occurrences of hate speech by responding in a specific way. But again, like the social network is a specific context. And without designing that context, we have a limitation on what they can actually do. So it's not Tay that was perhaps it's not the only problem. It's about how Twitter itself as a context breeds that kind of a bot or breeds certain type of people to really troll others when it's anonymous. Right. So I really think that designing the context for the bot to support the reduction of hate speech, for example, that would be really valuable. But the community also needs some sort of monitoring. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minha. Next in line, we have Raquel. Raquel, I think you should be able to verbalize your question.
Okay, thank you, Minha, very much for your talk. It was a very interesting talk. I'm Raquel Prates from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. I was interested to hear a little bit more about the gap that you mentioned. You said there was a gap, and one thing that I was wondering was about accountability for the people who are designing the technology, which is intelligent technology, and making decisions, especially when there are life and death impacts on those decisions to people. Did people in your studies not expect the people behind the technology to be responsible for the technology? I mean, punishing the robot and might not be very effective. Maybe people would expect to punish the designer as a group or whoever would be accountable for that.
Yeah. So, there's some work on that. So at least in our participant group, we unfortunately did not ask a specific qualitative question, but we really should have. But I will put in a link for the responsibility gap and for some other work in human-robot interaction. So the thing is, it actually really depends a lot on the action, right? So when a robot does not make a utilitarian choice, so the robot I mentioned before, robots are expected to just switch the train track, right? So that it makes a utilitarian decision. And so if a robot does not do that, people will blame it. But when a human being makes that same decision, it's very different. People don't like it when a person sort of plays God, even though the effect is exactly the same. So people's perception of who's doing the action, a robot or a human, it matters so much, regardless of the outcome. So in that case, kind of fine-tuning, is it the designer? Is it the engineer? Is it, just the robot itself? That might be important, but I think first hurdle to get through is for people to sort of ask, hey, what is the outcome, right? And that's sort of the layperson's perspective. But I will kind of put in some work. This is on responsibility gap, and that's more from philosophy. And I'll also share something from HRI. Yeah. Thanks for the question, though.
So let's move for our last question, Minha, so we can move to the next item in the program. Claudia Mota have a question. I have a question. Claudia, feel free.
Thank you. Thanks, Minha. It was great. And I'm a little afraid or preoccupied or worried about Alexa. Do you think that Alexa could be a risk for family privacy? Sorry, it's a little different question, but I am a little worried about that.
Yeah. So yes and no. So Alexa can hear you breathe, right? So it's the problem is, again, it's not just the technology itself, but that the context it is invited into, that's more of the problem. So if you have something like Alexa in a public square, and they did this study in India. So just in an urban area, people could ask like a voice-based agent all kinds of questions. That's very different than inviting Alexa into your bedroom. And so I think it does pose problems for humans, for our families, when we kind of look at where the technologies are sort of being populated in. So it's not just the artificial intelligence increasing, but that we feel more comfortable having them in our home. So there's some work by Porcheron and colleagues about how Alexa is used to sort of regulate norms as well in a family. So usually there's just one Alexa for everybody in the family. And depending on who gets the right to speak to Alexa, the norms of the family, so who gets speaking rights, who doesn't, who gets to speak first and last, that seems to be, how a mere piece of technology sort of gives power to specific people, right? If it doesn't recognize the voice of a child, for instance, or it doesn't know what the child is saying, then yes, it would change how the child's perceived by others in a group. And that is exactly sort of the collaborative mind perception aspect we have to be aware of. So it might be a bit of a different answer than you might have expected, because I think it's changing the context of what we're intimately okay with now. But even without that, if we sort of have a shared machine, it might give power structures sort of a new definition, even in family settings.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome, Minha. Was a great pleasure. I was talking to Bruno here on a side channel. So if I could, I would let people ask you questions. I could ask you questions like the whole afternoon. I know it's late there, the whole evening there, but we need to move ahead. Thank you very much once again, Minha.
Yeah, thanks.
It was great to have you with us.
Thanks so much. I set the last link there for the question that was asked earlier. Thanks so much for having me, and I hope to maybe catch you guys in person next time. Enjoy. See you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Pessoal, aviso. Próxima sessão, a gente tem agora um breakzinho rápido, e aí a gente volta para a sessão de desenhos de pesquisa, ok? Vai ser na outra sala, eu acho. A gente tem que só confirmar aqui a sala. Então, fiquem ligadinhos no e-mail que a coordenação mandou e no canal do Discord tem todos os links também. Certo? Voltamos daqui a 10 minutos,
Bruno,
mais ou menos. 20 minutos. Oi?
Bruno, só um minutinho, porque a gente tem na nossa programação aqui, a Maria Tereza está aqui, a gente tem a previsão do sorteio, né, Maria Tereza?
Ah, então vai, show de bola.
Sim, agora.
Agora.
Eu estava tentando aqui, fiquei muda, é isso mesmo. A Luciana também está presente aqui.
Oi, pessoal. Cadê a Tereza? Tá aí, Tereza?
Aqui.
A TT, ela estava aqui, mas ela disse que talvez tivesse que se ausentar um pouquinho, mas se ela entrar, ela participa